This is just a glorious example of a very well fortified gatehouse, one of the best ones I've seen in Britain.
Shadowversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I'm here at Warwick Castle. Now, Warwick is a very interesting one because it's a type of castle that has had to kind of adapt or die over the ages, and as a result there has been many changes that have kind of been added or modified as the castle progresses through history. But what you can definitely still see is some of those original features, and especially fortified features, prominently more so by the front of the castle that we're facing right here. We have a bit more access because we actually have a tour guide. So this is Ben. And you're one of the main tour guides here.
Yes, I look after the history of the castle, its interpretation, of course how we do our tours to our guests as well. And I've been here for 13 years looking after this wonderful historic site.
Awesome. Now, when I'm looking at the castle from this side, there's a couple of things that jump out at me more than others. One of the really things that I love, which we've been exploring a lot of castles, mostly through Wales so far, and then we're going to be exploring more. But there's a feature on this castle that is not as common as, say, French castle and everything, and that is the machicolations that we see on the side towers right there. Now, I was just talking to Ben before, and you mentioned that those towers, they date to 13th century.
The 14th century,
14th century,
yes, 14th.
Yes. 14th. And that makes sense because machicolations is a type of architectural feature that appears on castles a bit later through the medieval period. So if you're looking at castles from especially like the 12th, most definitely the 11th and even the 13th century, they're not as common. But when you get later, that's where you start to see more machicolations, even on English castles. So some notable things to kind of comment on from the outside is it has a dry moat. Now, does that moat run around the whole castle?
It's about two-thirds.
Two-thirds?
Yeah, about two-thirds of the castle.
Because you were just pointing out that there's a kind of size disparity between the two primary towers, but it's mainly because this tower is actually sitting on a lower elevation.
It is, yeah. The entire building's on a big cliff face. They used solid bedrock to build the castle, and the entire south front has the River Avon next to it, so it protects that entire southern side. It gives the look that the castle itself is a bit lopsided. Guy's Tower, built in 1395, is 4 metres shorter than Caesar's Tower, built in the 1350s, as the base extends further down to the bottom of the river.
Now, what you can see from the outside is already signs of some of these modifications and changes that has been added to the castle through time, though not as much here compared to other parts of the castle, but certain things that you can notice are larger outwards facing windows, especially on the gatehouse that we see there.
Yes, so the gatehouse was used quite heavily and extensively throughout the Middle Ages and on into the 17th century. During the English Civil Wars of the 1640s, our castle is parliamentarian, which is quite unique. Most castles were not parliamentarian, and you can tell because they were destroyed.
Well, I know, that's what happened to Corfe Castle.
Absolutely.
Bastards! But was Warwick Castle besieged during?
We were indeed. We
Wow.
were one of the first ever sieges in the war. August 1642, about 6,000 royalists laid siege to our castle. Our garrison was 302 men strong.
302.
Yeah,
well, that would have held up pretty well.
We did very well. We held up for 3 weeks, and the royalists gave them left because they spent too long trying to get the castle.
Yeah.
The siege was a disaster for the royalists because it was early on in the war, and no one had a proper army at the time. It was just ragtag soldiers. The cannons were too small and ineffective. We had cannons. In Guy's Tower, they actually built those larger square gaps. Those are cannon emplacements. They were added in the 17th century.
Oh, that's cool.
And they were designed for cannons. So we were shooting into the town of Warwick. That's where the enemy were. Their cannons were in the church. And for 3 weeks, there's a massive bombardment.
The
and
cannons
the
were in the church.
They put them in the church. Yeah.
It's like
Crazy.
That would have been considered sacrilege, I'm assuming. But
Civil War, anything goes.
That's right. But yes, I'm assuming the church probably didn't appreciate that. But
no,
again,
they'd already been destroyed quite heavily by the Puritans. Warwick was quite a heavy Puritan centre, and our owner Robert Greville was a Puritan man, and he actually had the stained glass windows destroyed in the church as they were Catholic saints.
Bastards. Yeah, so you can see some larger outwards facing windows, and when we look to the the left side over here, there is a lower kind of part that's been added to the outside, which has larger windows again. And so that wouldn't have been part of the medieval defences originally because it's too much of a defensive weakness.
Yeah. It's purely an extension to the rest of the castle. It's the brew house built in the 17th century. So it's purely designed to brew beer, and it was also used as a wash house for a time as well.
There we go. And because, well, I mean, I've seen some of the other rooms, and we'll get to show you, some of the additional rooms that were built around the 19th century are very lavish and fancy. And, I mean, I see more, I guess, 19th century decor on that, not necessarily neo-Gothic or Gothic revival.
It's a big mixture. The owners of our castle, especially in the more modern era, their tastes in fashion changed quite a lot.
Yeah.
So, for example, the countesses of Warwick are often the ones in charge of the decor. And when one countess passes away, the next countess will come in and say, I don't like that, strip it down and replace it with something else. We have a lot of Italian, French influence. There is some neo-Gothic, but not a huge amount.
Yeah.
We have some Japanese design as well in some of the upstairs bedrooms that are normally locked off to the public as well. So it all depends on the tastes of the family.
Awesome. So we're going to now go into Warwick Castle and take a look around. And the first thing that it jumps out at you, when I was walking through it, I had to say, it's the Gatehouse. So let's take a look at that. So right in front of the main Gatehouse, and one of the things that you notice first is a lack of a drawbridge, but this is fairly common with a lot of castles nowadays for convenience.
Absolutely. Towards the 18th century, and after the Civil War in particular, there's no need for a defensive fortress anymore. I mean, what's the point in having all this when cannons can just blow you up? So when we were modernised into a more of a stately home, the Greville family that moved in the 17th century wanted to modernise their house. And by taking away the drawbridge, they've added a lovely stone bridge, make it just easier to get inside the castle courtyard itself. And they also added tracks for horse and cart to go through as well.
Yes. But that's not to say there aren't a lot of medieval kind of things that are still on the castle. As you see from the outside, you see the arrow loops that are now actually bricked in.
They are, yes. So that would have been done more than likely during the Civil War, and they installed larger windows. Again, adapting the castle. Guards would also live in there. A lot of bedrooms would be placed in the Gatehouse and Barbican, so there would have been quite a few people living in there at the time as well.
Now, this also strikes me the type of gatehouse that would have been quite useful, having some type of hoarding atop to really get more purchase for anyone trying to sail the gate. But what's really cool is that this is a longer type of gatehouse. So we'll go this way, and already still remaining are two portcullises. Are they still functional?
They're functional, yes. Well, the first one is anyway. So we use it actually today. When we close the castle of an evening, we always lower the portcullis gate.
And so look at the length of this gatehouse that we are entering into right now. So right above us, behind this portcullis, is murder holes. And so if we take a look up, you'll see them right there.
You also got the wooden, so there would have been a wooden door here. These iron hinges would be a very thick, an oaken door here, very thick oak door. So there'd been extra defences.
And the position of the door and portcullis is all very intentional. So if they got past the portcullis and they'd have to deal with whatever defences were above it, perhaps like a hoarding that would have been added, then they got to come to the door. But to reach the door that would be here, you're standing right underneath the murder holes. So the murder holes are placed very intentionally in the correct position. Now this area is interesting because is this a doorway or a passage or something?
So this here, we're not entirely sure what this would have been. More than likely, it was purely for an extra bit of storage, as we do have one here.
Yes,
so they would have put barrels, storage here, as they were bringing supplies into the castle. But it's all part of the newer part of the Gatehouse when they were adapting it, especially in the Civil War. Bits that they did keep, though, were these things. They're often called sally ports, but really they're just designed to go inside the actual gatehouse itself and control the winch for the portcullis.
And so this would usually lead to arrow loops on the flanking forward towers. And when we come here, so would another door be placed here?
So no, this has been an open area. You'd have murder holes just here. These murder holes are just an extra measure. And it leads you straight into the killing zone. Yes,
because this is open. Now this is really interesting because you see cases of this design and the naming of this specific thing where you have a passageway that's flanked with walls on either side, I haven't come across a name for this style of design in English, but in German it's called a Zwinger. But what it is here basically is that you come into this open area and you have an embattlement on either side, as well as what looks to be small arrow loops that are angled downwards to just shoot and destroy anyone.
So there would have been archers probably in here. The ones that you see further up, actually, at the top of the wall, they're actually murder holes, but they're sideways facing, so you can pour things out. It's like a drainage system. Small things are poured just into this area.
And it's a misconception to think that they would pour oil. Oil is a valuable resource. There's a lot of other not valuable, nasty things that you could throw down on people by heating up. Sand is actually a really interesting one. You get sand white hot, doesn't have to melt, but that'll get in armor and you won't be able to get it out, and that would just be horrifying. Boiling water is one, but boiling water would actually start to cool pretty quickly in the air as it falls down. But another interesting one is boiling urine. which would have been rather nasty. And this is a death zone right here. As fancy as Warwick Castle has been evolved through the years, it still has very distinct medieval death features of castle
The family
design.
loved it, yeah, wanted to keep it all original.
It's absolutely gorgeous. And so this is the first castle in Britain that we've been able to go through that has this feature right here, and it is huge. Next portcullis here, which is again trapping everyone in this kill zone Zvinger area. Behind it, 2 layers of murder holes, big hinges for another door.
Yep,
And
door.
exact same philosophy. To try and knock down this door, you have to stand right underneath those murder holes, which would just be awful to try and deal with. So it's interesting because the entrances of castles are usually the weakest part on castles, which is why they ramp up the defences. And now it becomes like a, I guess, cost versus loss thing. Is like, all right, how many people would we sacrifice or lose trying to bust through this gatehouse versus trying to go over the walls in another area? And so this is just a glorious example of a very well fortified gatehouse, one of the best ones I've seen in Britain. So this is actually the entrance into the Windless Room. It's one of the side flanking towers, and you can see stoned in arrow loops on either side. So it's a defensive room, but look how narrow this entrance is. So come through. All right, so this is actually really, really cool. When you said you were going to show us the windlass for the portcullis, I was actually expecting basically like a wrought iron, more modern thing. This is actually a very medieval windlass.
Yes. I think we often have a saying here, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. So it's been working for a long time. We've had to replace a few parts here and there, but the mechanism's still the same, the counterweights.
Like, look at this big counterweight coming here. So if we come in closer, you'll see a big stone just hanging right here. And so that's actually the counterweight. And another interesting thing to note is windlasses are often assumed to be above on a higher level in the gatehouse. We're actually on the ground level on the side. And so there's obviously pulleys that redirect the rope over. And so, yeah, windlasses, they can be above, but also right on the side here. Now, something that I also really love is that the actual metal components of it, those are components that absolutely would have been able to be made through forging. And so it's more of a necessity to have those made out of iron because so much weight is on them. But then the rest of the components are wood, which is really, but that's exactly what it would have been like for the medieval period. So this is actually a very authentic looking windlass, and it's not super complex.
Not at all, no. I mean, one man can do this quite easily, and they're lifting nearly half a ton worth of gate.
Yeah, and it's mainly the counterweight. You don't actually need a gear system with like a smaller cog attached to a larger cog to give you a better kind of ratio on the turn, because the counterweight is providing most of the force then, and so it's just rope, pulley, winch. It works. So Ben, you were just saying that this is one of the more defensible kind of gatehouses in England, really?
One of them, definitely. I mean, the family that lived here back in the Middle Ages, especially the 14th century, they were called the de Beauchamp family, or in French, de Beauchamp. The de Beauchamps lived here for close to 200 years, and they wanted to make sure that their home was not just fortified, but glorious. And pretty much every single day we get asked the question, where does their money come from? Short answer, war. The de Beauchamps are very good knights. They served their kings very well, especially in the wars against France, the 100 Years' War. We captured a lot of French knights, and these men were dragged back to Warwick Castle. They were held in Caesar's Tower, mostly the tower that you were sleeping in. And
oh, really? So
absolutely, yeah.
Caesar's Tower was a prison for
It was a glorious prison.
rats and
It's a
knights.
luxurious prison, we call it, and we sold them back for millions. And it built most of the castle for us. Say French tourists, thank you very much.
There you go. You see, that's why you don't want to kill, nobility in war. They're too valuable. And, I mean, it goes both ways. When you go to war, you don't want to be killed. You'd rather be captured and sold off for ransom. So it's important to wear the heraldry to just let the enemy know, I'm too valuable to be killed. So when you mentioned that the Beauchamps profited a lot from the 100 Years' War, did they have a role to play in Agincourt then?
Not massively, no. The Earl of Warwick at the time, Richard Beauchamp, joined Henry V on his campaigns, but he didn't actually go to Agincourt. After the siege of Harfleur, he was left behind to secure the city.
Okay, so to have a foothold in France on this big campaign, they besieged Harfleur, and it went far too long than he was expecting. But once they finally were able to take Harfleur, they continued on and ran into some troubles, and then they had to try and retreat, and then they kind of got stuck, and that's what led to the big engagement at Agincourt. So Lord Beecham, he stayed at Harfleur and oversaw the city.
He was very good at politics. Henry V was a young, hot-headed man, wanted to go to war all the time. Richard Beecham was older. He'd fought in campaigns before, and he was much more level-headed, some would say. But Henry V appreciated him quite a lot, gave him a lot of wealth and power, and eventually he became the captain of Rouen. And that means in the 1430s, when Joan of Arc was captured, that's where she was taken, and she was held in his castle.
So he had a role in her execution?
He oversaw her imprisonment at Rouen.
Well, I mean, when you're dealing with witches, what are you supposed to do? That is actually really significant, because that's an important role that he has played, and this is his castle. Now we're looking at one of my favourite elements of the castle. It's tower behind us right here with this beautiful machicolated battlement at the top. Stands out, and again, one of my favourite features. We're actually now going to be going inside to take a look at this tower. Okay, so we are actually in the top room of the tower we were just looking at, and the tower is called?
Guy's Tower.
Guy's Tower. I mean, for the person who I guess is not very familiar with the castle, they might just see a room. Coming in here, there are lots of things that are jumping out at me. This room is actually quite amazing. So, first of all, it's luxurious, okay? Like, people might think this is small, you know, the room for a large bedroom, but this is the type of room that entire families could live out of. But this room specifically, Ben just mentioned, was more of a guest room. Now, this room, he was saying, is mostly untouched. This is very much close to its 14th century.
Pretty much, yes. A lot of the other tower rooms are modified in the more modern era, the Victorian era, for example. Whereas this room, for some strange reason, the founder didn't want to touch it. It was open to the public for a while, so there was a bit more modern graffiti in here, but for the most part, it was just left closed off. And that's why in this particular room, we do have graffiti dating back to the 14th century.
Now, of course, you have a dedicated fireplace, so that makes this room more livable. Now we come to the other rooms. This is really interesting. We are standing on a stone floor, okay? But bear in mind, we're on the highest room, and the way that they do that is what we see right here. There are vaulted ceilings underneath us to provide a stone floor. The reason why this is significant is that a stone floor has much greater load-bearing capacity than a wooden floor. And so if you have a stone floor, well, there's been something I've wondered about, I guess, tower rooms, if they would have divisions within the tower rooms itself. And it's like, well, if it was a wooden floor, it would be tricky because adding another wall on top of that wooden floor is a lot of weight. But what we're seeing right here is because we have a vaulted ceiling underneath, well, that can support huge weight. So we actually have additional stone walls here, making 2 additional rooms on either side. And so this makes this room actually quite luxurious, or this floor really, because you have the main living area, and then you have 2 adjoining rooms, and you mentioned that right here is actually a garderobe.
Absolutely, yep.
Let's take a look. Something just really, really cool. And so, Ben, you mentioned that there's a divot right here, right?
Yes, yep.
That wasn't there originally. This used to be a straight stone. This has actually been worn down from people stepping right here over the 600 years this castle has been here. And sandstone actually does weather easier with rubbing. But that's just really interesting to note. Wow, this is bigger than I was expecting. This is the garderobe, or toilet. And Ben, it's bigger than I was expecting.
It is. It's again, for luxury.
Luxury.
So you'd have had, of course, the toilet just here. There'd been probably a clay bowl in there to wash your hands with a bit of rose water, perhaps. It would have been quite nice.
They wash their hands, people.
They were clean people.
Rose water in particular, and it was also common to wash your hands in rose water before a feast as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
So this poo chute, essentially, I'm assuming it goes right down to the moat.
It does indeed, yeah.
And that's a useful thing for moats. That's where you throw your junk. I've seen a number of garderobes in castles already. This is the biggest one I've seen. Except for maybe Chepstow. Chepstow had like a more public garderobe with like 2 seats and it was really big. But for a private garderobe, this is huge. And again, just luxury. You've got 2 arrow loops, which actually let in more light than you might assume. Even though it's kind of dark here, it would be almost pitch black without those windows. You mentioned these stones here, that they were, furniture was affixed.
We've had fitting, yeah.
Fittings.
Put into the walls, yeah.
And look, there is a fleur-de-lis carved into the stone here.
Yes, it's funny you should mention that because this room was also used as a prison in the 17th century during the Civil War. A lot of high-ranking royalists are held up here, and that's the symbol of Charles II.
Okay, so there's another room here, and what would usually this room be used for?
So a bit of storage, luggage you bring with you, and also, of course, your servant.
Of course, of course. Now, servants are interesting because people often aren't aware that a lot of times servants slept in the same room as the people that they served. And in a lot of medieval homes and everything, they had beds with trundles underneath that would be pulled out for the servant to sleep in, right next to the medieval noble that they were in service to. And so, well, again, this is a luxurious room. This, potentially, depending what you want to use it for, has a separate room for the servant. So the servant would have been pretty happy about that. But let's absolutely take a look. So you can see this beautiful vaulted ceiling right here. Like it's a mini one. It's really compact, but absolutely right there to support stone floor above us. These alcoves right here, what were they for?
Bit of storage, shelving for the time. We've got some graffiti here from the Middle Age. This is 14th century, and it's in Latin.
It is. And for graffiti, that's as well done graffiti. That is actually in the medieval script style.
We had it translated many years ago. What's left of it translates to Hail Mary, Mother of Grace.
Lovely.
We're not sure who did it or why. Perhaps when the tower was built back in 1395, they brought in a priest or a bishop to do that, bless the tower. Or perhaps it was a very thankful bishop they allowed to stay in the tower for one night. But somebody, of course, with enough knowledge to write that.
Which is another sign of, you said this dates to the 14th century.
Yes, yeah.
Another sign that this was not plastered.
More graffiti. As I mentioned, the Beecham family built the towers walls, and there's constant reminders over whose house you're in. So that's their coat of arms. Originally, might have been painted even, because their coat of arms was red and yellow, with lovely crosslets, 6 crosslets all over the front facing of their coat. So again, no matter who you are, you could be a king, you could be a queen, but you're reminded that you are in the home of the Earl of Warwick.
I love it. And this is old as well, dates to
14th century. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, again, not plastered. And so I love that we're getting to see multiple examples of castle interiors as we go through and see all these castles in Britain. So this is a luxurious room, right? And even though luxurious though, the windows, they're bigger, but they don't go too big. So if you see here, remember though, we're on the highest level of this tower, so you can get away with it being a bit bigger anyway. And you could almost actually even have it significantly larger because we're so high up. And we've seen examples of that in some of the other castles we visited. But this is an example of one that's more on the conservative kind of larger end, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but it can be larger because it's higher, but they still kept it thin enough to be defensible. And even though it's a luxurious room, they still would have used this for defences. They would, wooden shutter there that they could open up, either shoot through, throw things down. So we're now standing on the rampart of one of the outer walls, and I just want to point out this railing here, of course, wasn't
health and safety.
Yeah. Now, did they really? I haven't seen examples of. They didn't really have railings.
We have had no evidence of railings at all.
They just trusted people. Be careful if you're an idiot. It's your own fault. Look at this gorgeous, crenellated wall here. We have the arrow loops still in place along the Merlon. Proper height. I've pointed out lots of times, but in a lot of movies, they're always too low. So we are standing on the top of the primary outer gatehouse. The gatehouse, like I said, I love it so much because it's a longer gatehouse, and there's a lower section that extends further out in front of the portion we're standing on right now, it's the barbican.
Barbican, yeah.
Yeah, now the barbican is a term for kind of like the outer additional gatehouse that's usually added. Sometimes it's attached to a castle, sometimes it's separated, but if it's the furthest most kind of sometimes separated, but it's sticking out, that's the barbican, and there's a lower section for that. What's really interesting about this one right here is this looks like it's still 14th century by the weathering on the stone.
Most of it is. The top parts aren't.
Yes,
so a lot of the top
right
bits
here.
are what I like to call bad 1950s restoration, as they were using very cheap stone, often wasn't the same kind of stone as the previous sandstone. Nowadays, of course, when you restore a castle, you have to use the exact same materials, which is very expensive. We have
That's interesting, because when I was going through Caerphilly, I was looking at some of the restored stonework, and it actually looks like they used concrete stone in some sections.
They did that here as well in the 50s. It was terrible. Whereas nowadays we know better.
Yes.
So we know how to restore things much more better than they did. We use separate companies to do this. Treasure and Sons, they've been in business since the 18th century, and they are the ones that specialise in restoring our castle.
So there's some really interesting features about this gatehouse top. Like these archways right here. It's essentially providing a second rampart on a higher battlement, and you have this lower battlement here as well. Now, this lower battlement is interesting because this is actually, it's a clock that's been added much, much later, of course. But I'm assuming there must have been a walkway or rampart.
There would have been, yes.
Yes.
Would have been.
And as you can see, so look, there's a battlement here and a battlement above with 4 kind of sectional mini towers. You could almost call them turrets, right in each corner, providing additional, I guess, surface area, like walkways, ramparts for the defences. So we are in the room directly underneath the level we were just on. So this is a gatehouse room.
It is indeed, and again, much like the tower, it is luxurious. So back in the 14th century, it would have been a bedchamber for somebody of importance, perhaps someone from Hyphen the Earl's retinue, or a key visitor. However, by the 17th century, it was used for guards. In fact, this became the bedchamber of a man called Major John Bridges. He was the man in charge of the garrison during the Civil War at Warwick Castle, and he adapted the room to his own needs. Whitewashing happened, a new ceiling was put in, and he even has his hat and coat rack just up there.
That was one of the things I was going to comment on. There's a very distinct whitewash still in place here. There's a larger window. Was that opened up for his convenience?
More than likely, yes. Yeah, all changed.
This window here, though, it looks like it's...
This is original.
Yeah, this exactly. It looks like it has original stone framing right around there.
And it gives you a good view of the Barbican.
It does, actually. And if this could be one of the defensive windows you'd actually shoot out for anyone in that, Zwinger section of the gatehouse. And you can see there's the original hinges for the shutters that would have been there to close the window. But it's also a good example of a 14th century larger window. They did have windows, sometimes even facing the outside, and they didn't always have to be arrow loops. It's just arrow loops were more common because they're more defensible, but where you could get away with it, have a window. So we're standing on a fairly precarious floor right now.
Very, yeah.
How old is this floor?
This is more than likely 17th century,
Wow.
and they have just not bothered restoring it. So as you can tell, there are bits that are dipped.
There's
no support there anymore.
Yeah, I would not want to step there.
You'd end up falling about 10 feet down into the next room below us.
Oh my gosh.
Not a fun fall, really.
Oh, look at these big beams in the roof, though. That's gorgeous there. But again, a luxurious room. There are 2 openings to separate
and they're
rooms.
much larger than the previous ones. So again, a garderobe area would be through here, along with extra storage. That there would have also been extra storage.
So we've seen kind of alcoves there that were inlets into the stone walls itself, and this is a perfect example of what they actually would have put in them. It's a cupboard. It's a shelving inset into the wall itself with an actual door on the front with an opening cupboard door as well. So yeah, storage all around. What not could have been put here? Again, maybe shelves or a washing basin of some kind even. And we've got shelves and a little window. And this is interesting. They've actually extended it a little bit to have a desk, essentially. This is great. Okay, so this is another adjoining room to the one we were just in.
It is, and this one's unique in the set. It's actually stepped up. You've got steps leading up here. You'd had a garderobe just to our left through here, a very small garderobe, nothing like the luxurious one.
Much smaller. In fact, this is more typical of a lot of the garderobes we've seen. Yeah, it's as you can see, a little bit more cramped, but still little inlet there for maybe or water to wash your hands in or something like that. But still having a separate private garderobe that's only for use in your room. Yeah. Fancy and luxurious. So this is just facing the garderobe we're just in, and look, it's got a mini fireplace right there. So this is like a separate attached bedroom to the larger bedroom. And you're mentioning perhaps for guards or guests?
Yes, I mean, as I say, back in the 17th century, the gatehouse and barbican was used extensively by the captain of the guards, used by general guards as well, so that they used this as living quarters.
Yeah, they're interesting. So a lot of holes, and this could have been hooks for hanging carpets.
Absolutely, carpets perhaps, more furnishings.
Look, and they go in the alcove all the way around. Oh, I love it. I love it. So we're standing atop Caesar's Tower, and this tower has been heavily restored because it was quite damaged. When did you mention it got repaired?
So the castle was under extensive restoration in the 1950s. So, for example, this tower was not open until the 1950s to the public. Guy's Tower was. It was much more stable. So the staircase had to be completely redone, and they made it out of wood. And then they also redid the floor up here as well.
And the floor, there's something particular. Even though there's like a type of, concrete or bitumen layer on top, what we do see through are the openings for the machicolations. right here. And so you can have a look down. Oh my gosh, it gives you full view to the tower beneath.
Well, that's the inside of the courtyard. The ones on the other side, it takes you down to the river. They're even more impressive. It shows how tall we actually are.
Well, let's have a look.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we're now facing the outside, and if we have a look here, look at the field of view Matriculations give. Like direct line right down to the base of the tower. Oh my gosh, and you actually get a fairly long range forward as well from this angle. So you could shoot, I'm aiming through the Matriculation, what looks to be 10, 15 meters away from the wall at least.
Absolutely.
And so if there were anyone trying to assail the walls with an escalade or something like that, even they're not standing directly against the wall when they place the ladder, they would be a bit further, to angle the ladder, you could still just be able to shoot directly at them.
And the best thing is they didn't need to do this because this tower is facing the river. So the river protects us on the southern side. But they added them anyway. Because you never know.
You never know. And they look amazing as well. It's funny that they've become such a distinctive feature on castle design that in later chateaus and things like that, they add fake Matriculations because they look so cool. So behind us right now is one of the key signs or indications of how old this castle really is. We're looking at the old moats. And so that's meaning that this castle, way, way back, was an actual motte and bailey castle, which would put it around the 11th century.
It is indeed 1068.
1068. And so the motte is still there, as you can see. And as the castle evolved and grew, well, it's still part of the castle, so they had to accommodate for it. And so you can see the stone walls going up. Now, by the look of it, was there actually like a tower atop there at one point?
There would have been. So the original keep made of wood is of course long gone.
Yes.
By the 1200s, it would have been a circular stone keep.
That's what I was thinking.
By the 14th century, that was also knocked down to make way for the bigger and towers and walls. They had no need for a keep. Why do you need a keep when you've got such a defensive part of the castle?
Yes.
So the shell keep fell apart. Nowadays, it's just a nice view. The walls and towers you see today up there, they look old. Actually, they're not. They're a mixture of 17 and early 1800s.
Yes, you can actually see some more modern stonework at the base of that turret right there. It's not weathered at all. And so some modern kind of fixtures.
It's a folly, yeah. I mean, there would have been some stone walls up there. You can see at the base of that section of wall there, right at the very bottom. That's actually 13th century stonework.
Yeah, that looks very
And then
old.
they've just built on top of it. Warwick itself is on a big hill. There's been an established village or township here since the 600s.
Yeah.
However, during the 800s and 900s, Danish invaders were a constant threat. So in 914, the daughter of Alfred the Great, Princess Ethelfleda, built a burh, which is effectively a large wooden palisade and earthen rampart around what was then the town of Warwick. It was very small, less than 1,000 people lived here, but it was in a central location.
That's interesting. So my understanding is that I will always identify this as a hill fort, but it's the actual terminology, it's a burh.
A burh, yeah.
A burh.
Yes, it's an Anglo-Saxon defence. It kept the people of Warwick safe for over a century. Unfortunately, the Danes did burn down Warwick in 1016. King Canute came along and said, let's get rid of Warwick.
Yep.
And then when William the Conqueror came along, the town was all of a sudden brought to life again, and thanks to the castle.
So we're at the top of the motte at the moment, and looking at some of the stonework, like a decent amount of it is quite weathered. Is that is this a remnant of the old the keep that was here?
Possibly, but they may have used some of the original stonework.
Oh,
but,
you're right, they might have done that as well.
It's all about recycling.
Because compare this stonework to what we see underneath there. That is very recent, that stuff there.
It's very new.
But going in, this is the
you'd
top
be
of the
entering
motte.
into the keep.
And so a shell keep, it would be a rounded keep, okay? That would be ringing all the way here. But also sometimes they had divisions, like what we saw at Pembroke. It's a pity that it's not standing anymore.
When they built those towers and walls, there's no need for a shell keep when you've got such massive defences on the eastern front. Then you've got the river on the southern front. The northern front, which is that section, the town is in the way.
Yes.
So the town naturally protects the castle. Then where we're standing now, the western side, the back of this was one sheer massive hill. So to get into the castle would be very difficult.
There is an interesting kind of evolution that's similar to Chepstow Castle, actually, where the original defence, when it was built with nothing else around it, was a very fortified tactical position to put it. But when you add other things to it, it becomes less important because the other defences are so extensive. That's exactly what we saw on Chepstow, the tower. The Great Tower is sitting right in the middle of this castle, and it's actually a defensive weak point when you consider everything else. But if it was just the tower by itself, it's actually a great position for a single tower. This is a great position for a motte. But when you add everything else, it's less important now. We're on a part of the castle that was actually a much later addition, and Ben, you mentioned this was added as a lookout.
It was, yes. So the first room would have been a guard's post or a guard's lookout, and then this bit would have been added on in the 18th century as a place for the Earl and Countess to show off to their friends and family, the size of their home, their estates behind me, their gardens. It was purely, again, just pure decadence.
Well, I mean, it gives you such a great view of the manor house section and the courtyard. Now, this turret right here is an interesting thing. So what we see here, this is what is called a folly. So a folly is basically a fake castle. It's a building that's made to look like it has distinct castle aesthetic and features, but are not functional. It's not made to be a defensive castle by any means. They're actually much later, sometimes 19th century buildings that are just made to look like castles, and because they're fake, they're called a folly. And you can see, what's interesting, it actually has matriculations at the top, but there's no access to get up there. Again, they're purely for decoration. So from this vantage, you can actually see kind of the evolution of this castle, where we see some of the oldest towers, and we're going to the Gatehouse. But as you move over, you get to this 19th century kind of manor house, though it's a bit of a mix.
It's a massive mixture of dates.
Yes.
There has been buildings on this side of the castle since we believe the 14th century, especially the underground levels, the basement levels. However, by the 1600s, there was a massive project going on to modernise the castle.
Yes.
So the entirety of the house was redone. However, they did keep some of the original features. For example, the tower just down there, that's the Watergate Tower. That is 14th century in origin, and it would have been the entrance from the riverside into the courtyard, tradesman entrance, you could say. However, by the 16, 17, 1800s, it was heavily adapted. And in fact, you can see at the very top of that tower where the roof is, there's small little holes. Those were added in the Civil War. So soldiers were able to sit their guns through and shoot people. And then it became a billiards room in the Victorian times.
And Ben, you also mentioned this courtyard is not the medieval courtyard.
Not at all, no. I mean, it would have been about 10 feet lower, the original courtyard. By the 18th century, the modern aristocrats wasn't really a big fan of medieval history. They thought it was quite barbaric. So if you're living in a medieval castle, how can you be less barbaric? Or you modernise the house. So they hired in a controversial landscape gardener called Lancelot Capability Brown. His nickname is Capability because he would often go to a house and say whether it's capable of becoming one of his gardens. So he decided to knock down the towers and walls. The family said, don't do that, we quite like them.
Thank goodness they said no, yes.
Instead, he raised the courtyard in places by 10 feet. And by raising the courtyard, you have lowered the height of the towers in a different way. You made the courtyard open plan, picturesque, and possibly the worst thing he did actually destroy some buildings on that side of the castle. They were built in the 15th century.
Really?
It was part of what's called Bear Court. It was a mini fortress in the castle courtyard that was built on the orders of Richard, Duke of Gloucester, future Richard III.
And he knocked them down!
He didn't like them, so they don't exist anymore, sadly. And then he replaced them with trees instead.
But what's interesting, so the courtyard, you mentioned, has been raised by 10 feet in some sections, and so what that means is there's probably a lot of medieval foundational structures buried underneath this courtyard.
Absolutely, yeah. Still there to this very day.
And would they reveal certain, perhaps, divisions and lines of walls?
They do indeed, they still do. Back in the 1990s, there was a big project here to look for the original structures of the castle. They discovered a lot of stuff. For example, the base of Caesar Tower over there, the open courtyard area today, was actually the old kitchens, the original medieval kitchens.
You can really see those evolutions and differences. And when you get to this section right here with all these large windows, the kind of 19th century manor house, I mean, it is not medieval, but they did still add a crenellated kind of top, just to give the illusion of castle aesthetic.
Victorians loved it. I mean, to them, medieval history was romantic. It's strange to think the 18th century was all about erasing medieval past, but then you get to the 19th century and all of a sudden there's a resurgence, a new interest in medieval history. Granted, the Victorians didn't really understand what they were talking about and often built things that looked quite strange, having crenellations and arrow loops on a manor house.
And what's interesting is there's a lot of, not only in film, but just general fantasy, takes inspiration for fantasy castles, more so usually from this 19th century almost Gothic revival style building. And you even see backdrops for like medieval fantasy fairy tale stories with big windows and structures that look like what we see right here, because that's what they take inspiration from. So we're now in the Great Hall of Warwick Castle, and it is a later Victorian kind of interpretation of medieval decor. And so this is very much Gothic revival, though it still looks gorgeous. I love the roof. And Ben was just able to share with me that this roof is actually built more on the cheaper side, and it needed to be rebuilt because of a fire at one point.
Yes, unfortunately, a fire of 1871. It started in the private house, the East Wing. To this very day, we don't know what caused it. It spread into the Great Hall. It destroyed the ceiling, and that was actually lucky for us because the ceiling collapsed into the Great Hall, which then blocked the flames from destroying the rest of the staterooms.
That is
so we got very lucky with that. They had to redo the ceiling and remodel the walls. So the sandstone walls you see today, that's actually only about 5 inches thick. Behind that is the original burnt sandstone.
Really? And there is a great collection of weapons and armour, and Ben was just saying most of it is late 15th century and 16th century, and then even later after that.
Yes, the family were avid collectors. The Victorians, again, they loved medieval history, and when it came to weapons and armour, it tells that story of the age of chivalry. So they bought thousands of items just purely to decorate their home with.
And some of them are pretty darn nice. You were just mentioning this large... looks like a Zweihander right here.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's purely ceremonial. It's far too large. We date it to 1563, and according to a lot of the records about it, it's German in origin. Julius, the Duke of Brunswick, part of his royal procession.
Absolutely beautiful. So we're standing in one of the kind of manor rooms of manor house portion of the castle, and this is really instructive to give an example of something that is not medieval. This is very much, you mentioned Italian specifically.
Yes, Italian was very fashionable, especially in the 18th century when many of our earls were on their grand tours. A grand tour was almost like a year or two vacation for a young aristocratic man to travel the world, see the sights and become cultured.
Yes.
And Italy was the destination to go to. So you bring back these ideas, what you see in Italy, put it in your house, with the ceilings being done in this very gorgeous Italian style. The walls themselves are highlighted in 18-carat gold leaf.
Really?
Absolutely, yeah. They wanted to make sure it was the standout room because this particular room was actually a dining room. And not just any dining room, this was the state dining room.
The state
for
dining
royal
room.
visits only.
Oh my God, and you can really tell because this is stunning. And this is very much Renaissance, I guess, height of interior design. It's royal, it's palatial, it's the type of stuff you see on the palaces of France and things.
Oh yes, definitely, yeah.
So we are in one of the drawing rooms, and what's interesting about the term drawing room, it doesn't mean a room to draw in, it means to withdraw. And so Ben was just explaining after you would have dining or you had dinner it was, what did you call it? It was
the state dining room.
The state dining room. You would withdraw to a room like this to rest, let the food settle, talk and discuss. And there's a couple of interesting things to point out. So of course, this isn't medieval, okay? This is still very Renaissance inspired. And there's a big contrast in colour, isn't there? Like before we had bright white, now strong red, but still with gold leaf. Right on.
It was all about, again, colours representing different things. Not surprising, it's called the red drawing room today. The colour of the room has changed a lot over the years. It would have been a brown colour originally, which would have been a bit dark.
That is odd, yes.
But by 1844, they chose to change to this lovely crimson red, more than likely because it was more relaxing.
Something else to point out, which is interesting when it comes to 17th century kind of interior design, there's no real adjoining hallways. We've gone through from the Great Hall here into another room. And to get access to the next room, you have to go through this room and this door to get to the next one, which is kind of odd in my mind because, I mean, in more conventional architectural design today, we have hallways to connect rooms so you don't have to interrupt anyone in one room to get to another. But that's not the case for 17th century manor houses.
Absolutely. So there's one long straight corridor, all the doors would be shut, so the surprise would be there. If you're in this room and you've never been to the castle before, imagine all the doors are closed.
Yes.
You're in a much smaller space from the Great Hall. You've gone through the majesty of a Great Hall into what is, some would say, a disappointing room. So it almost like lowers your expectations. Then they say, right, you've relaxed for an hour or two, let's go dancing. And then the doors will burst open, you're led into the ballroom, the main
this is the
state room.
ballroom next. Wonderful, let's take a look. So this is the ballroom, and it is stunning. What period was this room?
This room was built in 1670.
1670, so 17th century, and this wood panelling is just...
Yeah, it's all Lebanese cedar wood panelling. It would have smelt amazing here when they first built it.
I can't, and the amount of artistry in this wood panelling with the specific patterns and designs they have carved in, especially on this window outlet, the alcove that you see over there. Oh my gosh, this is amazing.
Well, going back to medieval history, we're actually standing on the site of what would have been a part of the original medieval Great Hall. It's believed a lot of the window bay out there, especially on the outside, the southern part of the castle, that's medieval stonework. So they incorporated as much as they could into the remodelling of the staterooms in the 17th century.
Now, you called this the ballroom, but there's a big dining table.
There is indeed. That used to be in the state dining room.
Okay.
Weddings these days. We can't allow the modern bride and groom to sit on chairs that are 400 years old.
Yeah, makes sense.
But it would have been an open space. Things that would have been in here, the bowls, for example, those are Japanese. They're Imari bowls.
Oh, wow.
They were made in Japan to be imported to Europe. They date to about 1700, and the Greville family that owned the castle at the time didn't understand that Imari ware is to be used for display. They used it for rose water to wash your hands in and canapé bowls as well.
And again, this is an example of what fairy tale fantasy usually interprets as what castles look like in the inside. And for fairy tales, I think absolutely go to town. If it's fantasy, this looks amazing. Of course, use it for a fantasy castle interior. But for medieval history, this is not what the interior of a medieval castle looked like at all. And this is not even Gothic revival. There's very few medievalisms in this room. This is all very Renaissance, very fancy. I mean, oh gosh, look at this chair. This is just too beautiful to sit in, but I can't believe it. And moving through this ballroom here, once again, there's no adjoining halls. And so if you wanted to get to the next room, you'd have to go through the ballroom. And so what is this next room?
The men's smoking room.
The men's smoking room. And what a shift of colour again.
Absolutely, it's gone to pale green now. Again, designed to be relaxing. It was designed as a smoking room. Billiards as well were played in here. But it's also what we call the Civil War room, as a lot of the men in the portraits were soldiers that fought in the war of the 1640s, some of which died in the war as well. The strange thing is, you won't find a portrait in this particular room of a man from Parliament. They're all royalists. That's because the Grevilles changed sides. They were quite clever when it came to keeping their hands on their estate. When Oliver Cromwell died, who's the wax figure in the corner, in 1658, the family were among 6 nobles to go to France and bring back Charles II.
It's actually a good example of 17th century clothing.
It is indeed,
on this individual. And it's what's interesting just about this right here. A lot of people would interpret that to be medieval clothing or outfits, and there's a couple of key things it tells you not. Size of the boots. Medieval boots, not that big, and they did not reach that height. And the other big thing that shows this to be not very medieval, the collar. See this big sweeping collar around his neck as well. And so, again, people would interpret that to be medieval, but it's not. This looks like a buff coat underneath.
It is indeed, yeah. Leather buff coat, yeah.
Is that period?
Not at all, no.
Not at all.
Unfortunately, that's a Victorian reproduction, because this is actually in the fire of 1871. It was in the Great Hall.
Oh my gosh.
The buff coat burnt away. The armour luckily survived.
Thank
And
goodness.
so the Victorians had to make another buff coat in the same style to fit the armour.
So a buff coat is a thick leather coat that was actually worn in conjunction with, heavier armour, breastplates to resist bullet fire. Now, I'm not saying that a thick leather coat like that could resist bullet fire, but they added it onto it as an additional layer of armour that they would usually wear underneath it. Thick, there's a good example of authentic historical leather armour, thick leather armour. So that there is a royal bed, and the curtains stretching all the way to the roof. And Ben was just mentioning that this was actually a bedroom that was made for very high-ranking individuals to retire to.
Yeah. Only monarchs could sleep in here. It's very important if you're throwing a party. You've got to have areas just for monarchs to enjoy. And if the monarch goes to bed, the party ends. It's just next door the party is, so you have to be very quiet.
Like literally, we walked through a drawing room, a ballroom, and a smoke room. No hallways, right open to here.
Straight to the bedroom.
Yeah, the royal bedroom, essentially. And you mentioned that one of the reasons why it's attached to all these other rooms is that a royal, you would never send them upstairs.
No. And if you've got a drunk king or queen on your hands and you've got a big staircase, if they're too drunk to climb the stairs and they fall down, even worse, you're in
what a
trouble.
scandal that would be.
So it just made life easier for them, and it meant that they could just stumble into bed. Perfect. And even though it was meant to be a bedroom, according to our records, only one person has ever slept in here. And that's King William III in 1695. Other than that, it just stayed as a bedroom. Just in case.
Just in case. A transitory room to get to the next one. So we're in the servants' corridors of Warwick Castle here, which is separated from the main rooms. And that's a very Renaissance kind of later period thing. It wasn't necessarily done in the medieval period of medieval castles. They, especially a lot of the castles, because they were smaller, they had less room to give away to like give to servants and so they just had more communal spaces, although the kitchens and other areas were more associated where the servants would work and everything. But Ben, you mentioned a very interesting fact about how servants were treated specifically here at Warwick Castle.
Yes, I mean, you see all the time in TV shows, movies, where servants are often mistreated or they're paid badly. It's a horrible life to be a servant. When actually working as a servant, especially here at Warwick Castle, was a good job. The rate of pay was fair. You would sleep on site. There were bedrooms upstairs for servants, and they were so kind to their servants here. If you had decades of loyal servants and they got too old to work, you don't just throw them on the streets. You say to them, well, you've done your duty. You can stay here on site free of charge for the rest of your life, and that's what they did.
I want people to just pay attention to that. For loyal servants that served a good while, after their years of service, they were given a place to live for the rest of their lives, okay? That is extremely generous. We don't even do that in the modern day. But like, you know, yeah, you get long service leave, but once you're gone in the business, you're gone, right? And so the idea that there was always this divide between the classes and they're always at, fighting each other is complete bunk. Yes, there was times when there were like the peasants' revolt and other things when there was class division, but there are other times in which they got along pretty well. The nobility served a very important role in the medieval period. One of the original exchanges in the feudal system was protection. Okay, it's like, yes, you farm my lands, okay, give me a portion of what you're working on my lands, and I will give you protection, okay, and representation and other things like that. And there's this other side to human nature, right? And it's the idea of celebrity. Humans love to kind of revere the idea of celebrity, okay? Who do you think were the celebrities of the medieval period? All right, it was the royalty and it was the nobility. And so instead of being at a type of opposition to them, at many times there was a type of reverence and appreciation and even celebrity appeal to, let's go see, like the Queen is going to be, here at this location, let's go see her and things. And there was a lot more cooperation and appreciation between the classes than people realise. So we're now in the library of Warwick Castle, and this is built in the 19th century.
It is 1875, so fairly new compared to the rest of the castle.
But I mean, still stunning, and there's little hints of, I see a mix, honestly. There's Renaissance. Above the fireplace is something that, like, you could almost associate with medieval styling, especially right above the fireplace.
Yes, that's the coat of arms of the Greville family and the family motto as well. So it's all about showing off whose house you're in a very extravagant way. But again, as you say, it's utilising those old ideas, medievalism, having coats of arms. It's still done to this very day. Yes,
and there's also a mix of fashions. Like I'm looking at the chairs here. That's a completely different style to many of the other ones around us.
Again, mostly 19th century. This is a tortoise shell inlay chair.
Yeah, look at all the details added in there. Look at these old books. I was having a look at them before, and some of the titles of these are just, they're incredible. It's funny, so a lot of the factual books, of course, don't have too much factual value, but they do have historical value in terms of seeing what people thought of. But I wonder how many fiction books are here as well.
We do have some Dickens, Shakespeare as well. But a lot of what you see here, we've got a lot of biblical books, history books, very common. We've got copies of the newspapers.
Giant ones down there.
Those are newspaper clippings from the 19th century. They kept the newspapers in big binders. A recording of history.
So libraries are some of my favourite rooms. Now, they're not medieval rooms. Books are an interesting topic. They were not nearly as common in the medieval period, but it's not to say medieval people were necessarily illiterate. Most of them didn't read Latin, which was the standard for literacy, and so in that sense they were illiterate, but most medieval people actually had a level of literacy in their own language and dialect. Instead of reading books per se, what they loved reading were, I guess, couplets of poems, and I forget the name of them, but they were basically a list of different prayers, and they were prayer books.
Standard prayer books, yeah.
I forget the names of them. I can't remember them. But they were shared around, and they were very popular. And again, like the poetry books were particularly appreciated. And there's a poetry book that was actually written in Old English. And it's very important that that was written in Old English, because it shows that who would be reading a book of poems in Old English at that period. And this was before English was adopted in the nobility by Henry, the one that invaded Agincourt.
Henry V.
Henry V. And so before then, most of the English nobility spoke French. And so if you have this book of poems that is written in Old English, it's not going to be read by the nobility. It's going to be read by the commoners, because that's who spoke it. And so that's a key point of evidence to show that a lot of commoners spoke, or actually could read, right, in their own dialect. But in terms of having large library rooms like this, no, it's not medieval. So in later kind of, designs of nobility or rich kind of homes, there is a stronger distinction or difference, separation between the servants' areas and the families', living quarters. And we are in one of those areas right here. This is very much a servants' quarters. As you can see by up here, these are servants' bells. And you had something interesting to share about them.
Yes, so all the bells are numbered. So if you first started working here, you'd have to recognise what number corresponds to what room. But the longer you work here, you start picking up on something else. Each bell makes a distinct sound. So if you work here long enough, you can then recognise that's the sound I need to go to that bedroom, or perhaps the living room downstairs.
Now, what I'm kind of amazed about is the pull cord reaches all the way through the walls, all the way here, to pull on this part right here, which then... And that rings for a good while. You're going to notice that.
You definitely notice that. Yeah, they go to the tops of the roofs, and then they go down into the rooms themselves. So it's an amazing feat of engineering to get what is effectively a wire or string into a castle wall.
Yeah. I mean, that would have been really difficult to do. But it's actually pretty cool seeing this in real life, because the medieval period gets a really rough go at its modern day depictions. But there are other periods which they, for some reason, do really accurately. Like Downton Abbey is a good example. They go out of their way to be pretty darn accurate for the period in Downton Abbey. And we see these bells, these servants' bells in Downton Abbey. And now we can see ones in real life. The ones in Downton Abbey probably are real as well. So Ben has let us know that there was a number of servants that were able to live here until the day that they died. And some of them that were given quarters to live in, even after their days of service, would be in this servant section here. But if they died, what happened then?
Well, yeah, the issue is the body goes in a coffin, but because of how narrow the staircases are, you can't really get a coffin round the corner. So to solve that problem, you put in what's called a coffin gate or a coffin door. So you can now, rather than go round a corner, just throw them down there.
There's literally a gate in the stairwell which primary purpose is to provide access to take coffins out, which I find hilarious.
They thought of everything.
Quirky. So we are still in the kind of living quarters of the castle. And again, this is not a medieval part, even though some of the outer stonework might date to the medieval period. This is still very much 19th century kind of manor that was built here. And it's a great representation of how nice some of these rooms are. This is actually not open or given access to the public. It's in one of the other sections away from the public. You said there were up to 20 rooms in the
Yes, so individual bedrooms, there's 20 bedrooms. There are hundreds of individual rooms in the castle, used for all manner of things. And that is, you could say, the main reason why no one lives here. If you own a massive house like this, it's a medieval castle, it's a stately home, the running costs are tremendous.
Yes.
We spend, nowadays, on average, £500,000 a year just on purely stonework. Any other projects are going to cost more. We're going to spend £1 million next year on just re-leading some of the roof. So when the family lived here back in the early 20th century, they couldn't afford to heat parts of the castle, let alone live in parts of the castle. So a lot of the building work was not being done, it was falling apart.
Well, that's a key point right there. This is an old building, especially in certain parts, really, really old. And so they're aging, they're decaying. And that means repair work is actually going to be a fairly constant thing you need to do to just keep this place still standing.
It was always trying to fall down. And the family, especially in the mid-20th century, they really tried to stay here. The castle into the public, so they've got tourist money coming in. They added shows, attractions, shops, restaurants, any reason to get guests in, including lying to guests. For example, they had an exhibit here open back in the 70s. It was called Torture. And the Earl of Warwick at the time, he thought, how do you get the tourists in? let's make up loads of rubbish about torture. And again, those myths come into the castle.
Yes.
And it worked. Even to this very day, we get tourists or guests coming to the castle that came here 30, 40 years ago, and they say, I remember seeing this. That was fake. They'll lie to you. Yes. But by the 1970s, they had such little cash here. They started selling their collection and their land.
Really?
In terms of what you saw downstairs in the main house, the Great Hall, that's only a third of the collection before the 70s.
Wow.
The land they owned, they sold most of their land down to the last 64 acres.
You know, I see two sides of this, because at one side, I see two sides. Because on one side, I do see the tragedy of someone's home that goes back generations, just becoming too expensive for them to manage and then needing to sell it and pass it on. Yet at the other side, I see tremendous benefit for the fact that now it's become almost a piece of cultural heritage that everyone can appreciate and come in and admire and see the history behind it. And we're benefiting from that right now.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there's the two edges to this. Now, this room, when we say it's really, really nice. Look at these gorgeous big windows letting in heaps of light. Big fireplace, marble fireplace. This room currently is used as a office room.
It's a meeting and boardroom, yeah.
But back in, I guess, throughout the 1900s, there were heaps of parties being held here.
Oh yes, the parties here were tremendous. A typical party thrown at Warwick Castle at that point in time could last anywhere from 1 night to 1 week. It would cost the family a fortune.
A week-long party.
It was non-stop, and we have records of one party thrown here back in the late 1890s. It lasted for about 4 days, and it was called the Powder Ball. Now, it was a 4-day-long party, and this party consisted of 400 guests, all in fancy dress, and it cost our Countess of Warwick, who hosted the party, in today's money, £200,000 for one party.
For one party, 4 days, 200,000.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you love to be invited to something like that? Free food, there'd be so much booze, I bet.
Oh yes,
and
that porridge pot would be filled up many times.
Oh my gosh, and you didn't have to pay as a guest, you just came in.
No, you had to be invited.
That was the key.
And that was the key, you had to be somebody. And when it came to 19th century social ladder, the closer you were to the Prince of Wales or the King or Queen, the better you were in society. That's why it was very common for affairs to happen. So our Countess of Warwick was encouraged to have an affair with the Prince of Wales, and she did for 9 years. And that way she's now up the social ladder.
It's a type of advancement. And something that I particularly love about this room is the windows. Look at the view you have out of these windows. This is gorgeous.
That's the back garden of the castle out there.
Yep.
100 acres worth of just landscape land, including the river protecting the southern flank of the castle as well.
And now we're at the end. We have explored so many things here at Warwick Castle, and what's really striking, it basically was almost like a journey through time, where we started, 14th century, and then we were ending in rooms where they were having parties in the 20th century.
Yep.
And it goes through the entire thing. Now, we are on, was this the south side?
This is the south front of the castle, yeah.
And you really see almost the blend of everything we've been talking about, where at the very end, you see, 14th century tower?
Yep, Caesar's Tower.
Yep. And then we see a whole mix of things where there is some medieval stonework and windows mixed with Renaissance, and then we have, the Gothic revival kind of crenellations at the roof. That's Warwick Castle in a nutshell,
it is indeed, yeah.
Almost. But what's really been striking me about it is it's like a kind of capsule in time to show all these things, and there's been a decent amount of intentional preservation in a lot of aspects of this castle, preserved so people can come and appreciate in the modern day.
Absolutely, this is the beauty of Warwick Castle. They often say there's something for everyone to enjoy, and when it comes to Warwick in particular, if you like medieval history, you've got medieval history. If you like your Renaissance, you've got Renaissance. If you like Civil War, we've got that as well. And that makes us, again, I think, quite unique in the grand scheme of castles across the UK, as many of the castles that are ruins focus on, obviously, medieval, because they're a ruin, whereas we have everything. We have nearly 1,000 years of history just summed up in one building.
And not only that, there's been intentional effort to make it as accessible as possible to the public. Here at Warwick Castle, they have heaps of activities. You've got displays, you've got falconry, you've got the big trebuchet, you've got the War of the Roses and things like that. And I particularly appreciate that because it makes history accessible to the average person, which very well might be the trigger, the springboard for them to dive into something and find out such a wealth of amazing information and heritage as well, because I'm Australian, but my Australian heritage only goes back 3-4 generations. Past that, it's English, Irish, Scottish and Welsh. This is where my family comes from, and it's part of my heritage as well. And it's been a genuine joy to come through, and been genuine. Thank you for everything you've been able to share.
Pleasure meeting you as well. Thank you.
It's been great, and thank you everyone for watching it as well. There is more content, of course, to see as I'm travelling across Britain. I hope to see you there, and until that time, farewell.